Hello, and welcome to WorldCanvass from International Programs at the University of Iowa. I'm Joan Kjaer, and we're coming to you from the recital hall of the Voxman Music Building in downtown Iowa City. This is part 2 of our 3-part series called Our Lives Online. And in this segment, we'll be discussing access to the internet and the power of influence through online communications. I'm excited to introduce my guests in this segment. Nicholas Johnson, just next to me here, is a former FCC commissioner and an adjunct professor in the University of Iowa College of Law. Thanks for being here, Nick.
Thank you, Joan.
And next to Nick is Kaisa Dalrymple, assistant professor in journalism and mass communication here at the university. Thank you.
Pleasure, thank you.
So, Nick, I'd like to talk to you about this whole notion of access to the internet, access to media, whatever. When I was formulating the program, to go along with our overall theme, Our Lives Online, I was thinking mostly of access to broadband. What does it mean if you have access? How might you or your children be limited if you don't have access to good internet connections? That was sort of what I had in mind when you and I had a phone conversation.
Yes.
And you said, well, you know, during the years I've been working in this area of the media, access has meant lots of different things, and it might be useful to talk about what access has meant over time. So I'm going to pitch it to you and ask you to fill us in.
Well, you give me an open-ended question to the elderly, and you don't know what you're going to get back. I think it's important, but even before we get to the issue of access, to put what we're talking about in a kind of context, because it is the core of what democracy is about. And it's something that's going to always be important to us, but particularly in the years to come. And to know that it is a part of a package of institutions that Jefferson and others had in mind and went about deliberately to create. Starting with free what became K-12 public education, and then the land-grant colleges. How does that relate to media? Because you need the education first if you're going to be a citizen in a democratic society. It was by no accident that one of the primary purposes of K-12 as it became was civics class, training citizens to be what Ralph Nader called the public citizen. So that was one institution. Then the question was, how are they going to find out about stuff if they didn't have the money to buy a big library like Jefferson had? We'll have public libraries to go with our public schools. So anybody, regardless of their wealth, could have access to the riches of kings in terms of literature and books. Then we added a postal system. What does that have to do with it? Well, number one, it enabled citizens to communicate with each other. That early version of what today is the internet. But more important, and an indication of what they were about, were the special rates for newspapers, magazines, books, which you may have enjoyed in shipping stuff. Why? Because they wanted to encourage the distribution of information. In later years, the same principle was applied with telephone policy, keeping the local phone rates low enough that everybody could have a phone that would connect with the network of all the phones in the country. And then finally, with regard to the distribution of radio and television stations, so that people could have access to what might prove ultimately to be very much less useful to them than what they would find in their public library. But nonetheless, we wanted everybody to have it. The final thing that we needed to make this democracy work, in addition to those institutions of education and libraries and postal, the First Amendment. And I think it's important that we review briefly, and I hope this whole thing takes less than 2 minutes, but that what is it we're trying to achieve with the First Amendment? First of all, it only has to do with government, as you probably know. The actual language is Congress, which has been expanded to include every level of government. So the University of Iowa is covered by the First Amendment, as the folks in Jessup occasionally discover from time to time, and the City Council of Iowa City and so forth, as well as federal things. But the principles of the First Amendment apply as well to all institutions, corporations and military units and little private businesses and families. And what are some of those? Well, the first is that if you're going to have a governing democracy, you have to have a First Amendment. You have to have people talking to each other and expressing opinions and trying to build an organization to do something. The second thing is sometimes characterized as a search for truth or a marketplace of ideas. The theory being that only by taking all the wraps off and letting people talk and share ideas, not just the language of scientists, but everybody, we're more likely to come up with the truth. Then there is third, what I call checking value. That is, that the media is there to check on abuses within other institutions, primarily government, but also corporations. That's what investigative reporting is about. And it is, not incidentally, the only industry that is really mentioned in the Constitution, which is why we refer to it as the Fourth Estate. It is, in effect, a portion of government, the uniqueness of which is its separation from government, to check on government. And it's being put to a test these days. And then there is the matter that I call self-actualization. Someone once said, humans are the only species able to talk themselves into difficulties that would not otherwise exist. We are the talking species. And doing that is what it means to be human. So that even if nobody's listening and it has no impact, if someone has gone through the process of thinking through something and expressing it, that is valuable in terms of their own growth and self-esteem and so forth. And finally, there's what we call safety valve. People will ultimately be heard. You either give them access to the media and to the megaphone to speak, or they come up with some other way of being heard. As the young man said in Watts after the riots back in the 60s, and there was a lot of burning and breaking into stores and so forth, and he said, maybe what we did last night wasn't right, but nobody ever come down here and talked to us before. So we discovered that trying to silence people is not very effective. So that's my little introduction to put all this in context and try to put all the emphasis I can behind how terribly important these issues are. Now, in terms of access, as Joan said, we're really talking about two things. One is your access, well, and let's talk pre-digital for a moment. Back in the 60s, your access to mass media to express yourself, because you had no First Amendment right to speak via the mass media. You could try to buy a commercial on a radio or television station or a quarter-page ad in the paper. They didn't have to sell it to you. You had no right, no legal right to do that. It was a matter of grace. If they chose to invite me onto a show as a guest once before they realized they would never want to do that again, that's their choice. So that's your access to the media in the sense of being able to communicate. The other is access in the sense of being able to receive information. And both of these are blocked by a whole variety of factors, which would take up more than my rightful amount of time this evening to go through, unless either of you would like to ask me a question about it. Yeah, but for example, during the commercial radio and television days, Procter & Gamble had a manual for writers for their shows that included the admonition that there should never be anything in any script spoken by any one of the characters that would reflect adversely not just on Procter & Gamble, but on any business or business practice. My time has expired. No. Thank you, Amy. Huh?
No.
Isn't that Amy?
Your thought. Yeah, that's Amy.
Yeah, that's what
right.
I thought. Yeah.
Right.
I used to sing a song about an Amy. Yeah.
Well, regarding access to the internet, if we could just kind of
I think we need to bring in this expert. This young lady really knows about this stuff. I'm just telling you stories from the past.
Well, that's a good opportunity to jump to you, Kaisa. And we have talked about the access issue when we got together before the program. But I think that one of the things that you particularly study is how within social media, this kind of world we're living in now, how networks are formed, how persuasion can be used, how groups figure out whether or not they're being effective by what they do online. So tell us a little bit about what you teach and what your research involves.
Absolutely. Thank you for the pitch, by the way, or the plug.
Felt sweet.
It's really interesting, and I am going to touch on something that Nick mentioned, which is the idea of a marketplace of ideas online. When the internet was still fairly new, there was a lot of hope among a lot of people that this was a new opportunity to go back to Jefferson's ideas of a marketplace of ideas where all of a sudden we're all going to have access to this medium that would allow us to share ideas, to speak to people who we've never been able to be in touch with before with a higher level of frequency and diversity. What's really interesting is what we've noticed online is that we tend to cling to our own. And so while we do still have this very unique opportunity to be exposed to this wide variety of information, we still kind of rely on our offline habits online. And that's something that we're noticing. Something in particular that I like to teach about and talk about in my work are opinion leaders, which is a very old term, but the idea that there are these unique people in our social networks who we hold in higher regard. We consider them to be experts, but we also consider them to be like us. Opinion leaders are people who share our demographic characteristics, but also some of our psychographic characteristics, our behaviors, our likes, our dislikes. And these people sometimes float between networks. And we're seeing this online as well. But what can be particularly troubling, and Joan, excuse me, Joan and I discussed this earlier in the month, is the idea of these echo chambers. And so particularly in politics, we've seen that those who are already active in politics, those of us who are interested in politics, tend to seek out our own. We tend to follow people who share our opinions, who don't necessarily expose us to thoughts that are dissonant with our own. And that really poses very interesting questions about not only our access to information, because we tend to get a very tailored experience online, but also politicians' access to us. It changes the campaigning game quite a bit. So if we know that there is a very specific group of people who are not only interested in politics, but motivated and participating in politics, that changes the way that we mobilize people during campaigns. It changes the way that we discuss politics, and it changes the way that we learn about politics inevitably and talk with one another offline as well.
Well, and it seems to me that in this recent election, it allowed a lot of people to be very surprised about about what the election results in the end turned out to be. I think that when you're hearing your own folks say, if you hear the Clinton people say, it all looks good, you know, it's going to be tight here and there and whatever, but everything looks good, and you hear this coming at you every day, it might be that you would be a little bit more relaxed. Not that you wouldn't vote, but maybe you're a little less charged up. Whereas if you're on the other side, maybe you feel that it's extremely important that you rally absolutely everyone you know to get out there and vote in more aggressively than you might have otherwise. So I think that we're learning a lot of lessons that relate to this social media presence that people have, either willingly or they're just kind of observing it. Maybe you never post anything, ever post anything, but you see what filters through your group of friends, and it does have the power of influence, does it not?
Absolutely, a great power of influence, and we're not just influenced in the moments where we participate. You're absolutely spot on. We can simply be consuming the news, and still we rely on these unique people in our networks to, those are the people who we tend to retweet. Those are the people whose Facebook feeds we subscribe to. And it's become very natural to all of us to do that, to seek out, whether we know it or not, to seek out those opinions that we share, that comfort us to a certain extent, and that just increases that potential for influence. If we're not getting that opposing viewpoint, if we're not getting the whole story or the multiple perspectives on an issue, we can start to feel very extreme very quickly.
Some of us are old enough to remember a time when there were 3 national news networks. You watched either ABC, CBS, or NBC for the nightly news, and it was delivered, at least many of us wanted to believe that it was delivered in a somewhat objective way and so on. But now we can sort ourselves out very, very easily into networks and channels that are most appealing to us. And what do you think this does for journalism? The question for both of you. For journalism in these days.
I'll let Nick start.
You're in the journalism building.
Oh yeah, but I feel like you want to comment on this.
What do I think about journalists today? Yeah, well, they have a very much tougher job. And the first job, I suppose, is defining who is a journalist. I mean, if everybody who has a blog and a web page is a journalist, and I have both along with a Twitter feed. I can't keep up with Trump, but I try to get some out from time to time. So does that make me a journalist? You know, I don't think so. We also have a problem in keeping the newspapers in business. Rachel Maddow says we should all subscribe to a newspaper to keep them alive. So that's an issue. And then we have these journalism standards with all this other stuff, so that when BuzzFeed comes out with a 35-page document, the dossier on Trump and his relations with the Russians, that has yet to be confirmed by any mainstream media, now we've got a swirl of conversation amongst journalists about, you know, should BuzzFeed have put that out there at all? And then, of course, Trump went after CNN, and all CNN said was that the intelligence community was presenting to the president and the president-elect the fact that this material was going around, as it has been for nearly a year, at least 6 months, on the Hill and elsewhere. They didn't say what was in it. They just said, you know, at what point does a rumor become news? The fact that there is a rumor, not the content of the rumor, but the fact that there is a rumor with regard to somebody. Is that a legitimate thing for news media to do? And all kinds of questions like that are now being thrown out for journalists to deal with.
I agree. I feel for the last 4 years in particular, teaching news and the history of news, I've had to change it every year that I've taught it, and just kind of tweak things in the stories that we tell. I'm going to take a different spin on this question and come at it from perhaps a media literacy perspective and the public perspective. I agree with Nick that the journalist role hasn't necessarily changed, but we're facing a number of new battles and a number of new challenges. From the public side as well, we need to navigate this, and that's a real challenge. There's been some interesting work done on strategies for seeking out current events, and what they're finding is that students as young as elementary school, if we're not teaching people how to seek out current events, they're really lost. And so research that's been done on teenagers and adolescents who are given kind of free range online to seek out current event information, those who have had some sort of training, whether it be from their teachers or their parents, as to how to seek out that information, are very successful. They find the news very quickly, they find a variety of perspectives, and they can kind of complete that task. But for those of us who perhaps haven't had that training, it's really easy to get lost, and that's what people are finding is they'll start at government websites, they'll start with random Google searches, and what they're finding is that they burn out very quickly. And so that work is really pointing to the need to not only be thinking about things from the journalistic perspective, but the real need that we need to, the time we need to spend on helping people navigate these new news situations, identifying persuasion versus information, perhaps fake news sites from real news sites, having conversations about when journalism or when journalists should break news and what is news. These are conversations that the public has a right to be a part of, but we're not having those conversations enough.
There was a Stanford study of college students' ability to separate the facts from the phonies, as I put it, and they were simply appalled that they had virtually no capacity for identifying fake news from real news. So that's viewed as something that those of us who are educators ought to try to work in a little bit into whatever else we're teaching.
So what do you think the prospect is for these, say, the next 5 years, as you're educating a group of young University of Iowa students now and trying to help them understand what some of the complexities are, and what would be your greatest hope?
That's a wonderful question. My greatest hope, it actually probably won't change. It's been the same for a while, but it's to encourage and create critical thinkers. I think that's the most important thing. And it might sound a little cliche, but being able to leave a college experience and encounter situations where you're exposed to information that you don't want to hear, or that might be a little disconcerting to you. But managing those situations, navigating them, and figuring out what is the perhaps well-researched information as opposed to the rumor mill, and figuring out how to bring those conversations into your discussion and perhaps your civic life. Those I hope will continue to be my main goal for these students. But it's a challenge. It's so much more fun to just read those BuzzFeed quizzes and participate in those quizzes. And so it is a challenge to get students to really drill down and inspire that passion for seeking out information and challenging yourself.
And may I ask you also, just within the group of students you know and work with in journalism and mass communication, not everybody who goes through that school is intending to be an investigative journalist. Some go into marketing, some find future roles working in social media, maybe for a corporation, maybe doing their own blog. What kind of variety do you see with the students you're working with?
Oh, everything. One's in this room right now, which makes me very excited. So we see people working for ESPN. We've had students working for The Late Late Show. We've had students working at PR firms in Chicago and New York. I had a student last semester working on Broadway, doing PR for shows, and she just loved it. So we have a wide variety of students, and I, as much as I push the passion for that investigative mind, I remind people that persuasion isn't necessarily bad either. There's a role for that in our life, and it can be very powerful and very important in regards to how we also navigate certain situations. So here's a plug for journalism. There's lots of careers out there. Don't listen to what anybody's telling you.
Well, we won't have much time to talk about it, but when you talk about the power of persuasion, I know one of your main interests is sustainability and water quality and all of those kinds of things. And you find that through your activities online, you can really bring people to the cause.
Absolutely, absolutely. Studying water sustainability in Iowa is a real treat. We have amazing land here. We have amazing farmers here, and it's very interesting to see farmers break down perhaps some traditional views on that community. Farmers are pushing forward with technology faster than some of our youth are, in fact, and so seeing how these traditional networks that we think of that are very offline, so neighbors informing each other on yield and soil tendencies and runoff and things like that, are translating online, and we are seeing those networks move online. We're seeing a lot of potential to influence behavior, to have very important conversations about our future and the sustainability of our state.
Wow. Well, thank you both, Nicholas Johnson and Kaisa Dalrymple. Thank you very, very much. And
And thank you, Joan,
you're
for
welcome.
what you do with this
You're
program.
welcome.
It's
Thank you.
wonderful.
Thank you. And this is, you have been listening to part 2 of Our Lives Online, and we'll have another couple of guests come up in just a moment. We'll be talking about new technologies that are every day changing the way we live our lives. So thank you very much for listening. This is WorldCanvass, brought to you by International Programs at the University of Iowa, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.